the things I'm going to talk to you about today are all natural events. They weren't caused by people. And now we're lucky, really, living here because we don't have huge earthquakes. We don't have volcanoes. We don't have hurricanes, although we did have a very big, powerful storm in the 1980s that some of your parents or grandparents will probably remember. But that was really a great storm, not a hurricane. So the things I'm going to talk to you about are disasters, but they're not on the scale of some of the things you've been studying. Now, the first one, let me, what can kill or make lots of people unwell? Yeah. Or something, what, in the last couple of years, you haven't been in school for quite a lot of time, and what was the reason? Yes, COVID. And unfortunately, although some people got ill and died, most of us were okay with COVID, weren't we? Even those of us who caught it, we weren't really very ill. And the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is the worst illness ever. The worst illness ever in the history of the world. Does anyone know what it was? Yeah.
Cancer?
Well, actually, that's a very good answer. The plague, yes, thank you, the plague. I mean, cancer is a horrible disease, but it comes and goes all the time, whereas the plague was really bad. And it was called the Black Death because one of the symbols of it were horrible black swellings on people's bodies. So now the first thing I need to say, because I don't want you to go home getting your parents worried, oh, a man came to school today talking about the Black Death and lots of people dying. If this disease came back today, you could take an antibiotic and you'd be cured straight away. But of course, back in these days, there was no cure for it. And it was an awful, awful thing. And it spread across Europe in the medieval times. So you see the waves of it coming across Europe into England, up into Scotland. And huge numbers of people got ill and huge numbers of people died. So like I said, with COVID, fortunately, very few people died. But with the Black Death, possibly half the people in the country died. So look around, half of you could have died if you'd been at the time of the Black Death. That was definitely the worst natural disaster ever in Europe and certainly in Britain. And it came and disappeared and then it came back again. So for about 300 years, the plague would come, it would go away, it would come back. And when it came back, it was slightly different. But the doctors then didn't really know what to do, how to cure it. They gave people very strange medicines. In fact, some of the medicines that people were given would surprise you. So, for instance, if you were unwell and you went to the doctor and the doctor said, here's a live spider, I'm going to roll it up in honey and I want you to swallow it. What would you say? You'd say, this doctor's mad. Let's find another doctor. But that's the sort of cures they had back then. And for plague, I think one of the most weirdest cures of all was that rich people paid lots of money for this stone, this black stone, that they would often put in a gold pot because it was so precious and it cost them so much money. And they believed if they had this stone in their house, no one would get ill with plague. And this stone had come from far away in Turkey, and they believed it had been mined deep down in the ground, and it came from some special magical place that would cure all diseases. And we know now what those stones were. They were stones, and this is pretty horrible, that were force-fed to goats. So these people in Turkey made their goats swallow these stones, and then they go through the goat's gut, and they'd come out in their poo, and they would all be, because they've been all mixed up, they'd all gone to this dark, shiny colour, and they pretended that these were magic stones. And of course, they didn't do any good at all. No one got better through having them. So not an awful lot could be done about the Black Death. And this is one of the plague doctors. It's a bit of a dark picture, so you can't see it very well, unfortunately. But look, this doctor, he looks like a duck, like he's wearing a great big beak, this big round eye, and that's his mask, covered his face with a mask, and the big beak was over his nose. Yep. Yes, it was stuffed with something. The beak was with any idea?
The beak was stuffed with herbs and other things because people believed at the time that bad smelling air caused the flu.
That's right. People believe bad smelling air caused the disease. So the doctors thought if they had a nose full of nice, sweet smelling flowers and herbs, they wouldn't get the plague. But do you think that worked? No, it didn't work. Yes.
And they put like wax on the clothes.
Oh, we had to stop the fleas getting on them. Yeah, they did. Very good. So I think that would have been quite a frightening thing to see coming into your house. So that's the worst thing I've got to tell you, the Black Death. So we all ought to be very pleased that we are living in 2023 and not in 1348. That would have been a very bad year to have been around. And so whereas today, on average in Britain, most people live to 80 years of age. Some people, of course, live much longer. Some people live to 100. But on average, in this country, people live to about 80 years of age. At the time of the Black Death, the average age was probably about 30 to 35. So see how different it was then. So that's the worst thing I've got to tell you. Now, the next thing, someone said about hurricanes. Well, the worst storm ever to hit England and to hit Sussex was in 1703. So that is over 300 years ago. And this storm caused huge destruction, particularly at sea. And boats were blown in from the sea and crashed into the towns that were on the seashore. And hundreds of people drowned at sea. There was a great big lighthouse in the Bristol Channel, and that was completely blown down, not just by the wind, but also by the huge waves that were created by the storm. And here in Sussex, there was an awful lot of destruction, and the worst place to be living, where do you think the worst place to be living would have been? Brighton, excellent. Yeah, Brighton. Brighton was almost completely washed away by the storm. The houses, the roads, everything. The sea came in and destroyed it all. And Brighton was so damaged by the storm that it was about 50 years before the town recovered and was back to how it used to be. But they lost an awful lot of land during the storm. Earthquakes, well, the earthquakes we get in England are very, very small. And they're never like the earthquakes that we see, for instance, in Turkey, where hundreds of people die and huge numbers of buildings collapse. Nothing like that has ever happened in this country. Now, this is from the front of a newspaper for 1884. And this is about the worst earthquake we ever had in England. And this hit Chelmsford in Essex. And I don't know how well you can see it, but this church, part of it has fallen down. And here are people running into the street because they're scared. I mean, it's a scary thing, isn't it? If you're at home, it's just a normal day. The sun's shining. Plants are growing in the garden. Someone's maybe making dinner and you're just sitting there, everything's okay, and then suddenly things start to shake, and they start to shake more and more, and pictures fall off the wall, and maybe a chair falls over, and maybe slates fall off the roof and start crashing down. And of course it's frightening, and people run out into the streets. So it would have been very frightening for them, but nothing as bad as we've seen in other countries. So in 1833, there was a series of earthquakes. When small earthquakes have a different name, does anyone know what a name for a small earthquake is? Begins with the letter T. Yes. Tremor. Brilliant. Yeah, a tremor. So a small earthquake is called a tremor. And Chichester in 1833 had about 3 or 4 of these earth tremors, where the ground shook and maybe a chimney pot fell off, that sort of thing. And the people in the city were so frightened and they were so worried, they thought, we'll all go into the cathedral, the big, huge church. We'll all go in there and we'll pray. We'll pray to God that there's no more tremors. And guess what happened while they were all in the cathedral? Yeah. No, that would have been really frightening. But there was another tremor. And that really scared people. And a lot of people goes, right, we're leaving Chichester. We're never coming back. That's a sign that we should leave. But there weren't any more after that. It stopped after that. However, someone said about the cathedral collapsing. It didn't collapse, but all that shaking weakened the cathedral, and particularly the spire. So 30 years later, when workmen were doing repairs inside the cathedral, one of them looked up and saw that bits of rock inside the spire were tumbling down. And he said, I think we all better get out. And all the workmen left, and they'd only been outside for a few minutes when the whole spire, the whole thing, collapsed straight down into the cathedral. A huge pile of rubble and dust everywhere. So they were very lucky that they got out in time. So we haven't had much snow this winter. Have we? Was there any snow in Crawley?
Yeah.
Oh, there was. And was it very deep? No. And did it last more than a day?
Yeah.
Oh, it did. How many days did it last? 2 days. Okay. Oh, so where I live, which is nearer the coast, we had snow one morning, but it all melted by lunchtime. So you're a bit further inland, so you obviously got a bit more snow. But really, these days, perhaps because of climate change, we don't get the winters we used to. There was a time when every winter there'd be snow, and some winters the snow would last for weeks and weeks. And one of the worst snowstorms ever in Sussex was in 1836. And it started to snow on Christmas Eve. And the snow got thicker and thicker and heavier and heavier. And in those days, if you wanted to get from London to the Sussex coast to, say, Brighton, there were no cars. And 1836, there were no trains. So the way you got there was by stagecoach. You all know of stagecoaches? You've all seen stagecoaches? And the wealthy people who had money would be inside, and the poor people would have to sit on top, which would be all right in the summer, but not much fun in the winter. And even less fun when it's freezing cold and the snow's coming down. Well, on that occasion, the stagecoach got as far as Ashington, the village of Ashington, and the men were waiting for it at the Red Lion Inn, and one said to the other, he said, there's no way the stagecoach is going to come tonight. There's no way. The snow's far too deep. And then one of the boys said, it's coming, I can see the coach coming. And the other one said, no, you're making me up. You're telling me lies. There's no way the stagecoach is coming. But it was. It got through the snow and it got to Ashington and they changed the horses and then they set off again. But then there was even more snow, getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And they tried everything to push the stagecoach along. But in the end, it got stuck in the snow and it wouldn't move. And so all the people had to get out and they had to walk back to Ashington and to the Red Lion Inn. The horses were taken into a stable and the coach just stayed there, and it stayed there for 2 weeks. It took 100 men 2 weeks to dig a path through the snow along Findon Valley. That's how deep the snow was. And you know, if you drive along, you see hedgerows at the side of the road. Well, the snow was higher than the top of the hedgerows. Really, really deep snow. And it was 2 weeks before they could dig it out, and 2 weeks before the stagecoach could run again and complete its journey down to Worthing. The Lewis avalanche, which happened the same year, the same winter. So what's an avalanche? Someone who hasn't, you haven't answered it. What's an avalanche? It's a? No. What is an avalanche? Yeah, when the snow comes down the mountains. So often in the Alps, the great big mountains in Europe, in France, Switzerland, the huge, huge mountains, you get avalanches. And this is where it snows and snows and snows, and the snow builds up, and there's so much snow, and the weight of the snow is so great that it all crashes down the side of the mountain, often bringing rocks with it. And it crushes any building that it's in its way, and any people will get completely buried. But you don't really get avalanches in England because we don't really have mountains and we don't really have enough snow. And this is the only time ever in the history of England where there was an avalanche in the south of England and people were killed. And this was at Lewis. Do you all know Lewis? Near Brighton? Yeah. And if you go to Lewis, there's part of Lewis called Cliff. And it's called Cliff because the houses are built below a tall chalk cliff. And during that winter, at the top of the cliff, all this snow began to build up, more and more snow. And